Hi, everybody. This is Warren Herman, and today we're going to be looking at the Holy Scriptures and thinking about some frameworks to understand how to hear the voice of God, follow Him. So we're going to begin with a statement that Jesus gives us. He says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." So what we're doing here is we're trying to identify what is the voice of Jesus. We're going to get some criteria and some frameworks for understanding that. And we learn a little bit, we get some other hints about how to discern from the St. Paul's letter to the Romans, when he says, "And be not conformed to this world, but be reformed in the newness of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and the acceptable and the perfect will of God." So that's going to be another thing that's going to be in this video that's going to show us some important things. And then we hear in the letter of St. John, which says, First John chapter 4 says, "Dearly beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits if they be of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. By this is the Spirit of God known. Every spirit which confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God." So, these are some interesting criteria. They kind of give us some clarity, but they lead to some questions how to apply them, I think. I'm sure there's lots of wisdom from the church throughout the centuries, but what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a dive into a specific framework for understanding this. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to open up my little notes here, and we're going to go through this framework so that we can really understand some important things. And what we really want to understand is that when you look at this video, there's an actual little thumbnail picture on the description of this video, and it really describes this entire message of this video. And this is that there's certain voices that we should be listening to and certain voices that we shouldn't. And on the one hand, there's this little image of this kind of fallen angel and a wolf. And so we don't want to listen to voices that make us that are kind of a false positive, and things that are obviously negative and kind of bad, obviously bad stuff. Those are the voices we don't want to listen to. We don't want to listen to the obviously negative and sinful voices, and we don't want to listen to the false positive voices. But on the other hand, there's about 3 different things that we really want to be listening to in order to really be having that kind of North Star in our discernment. And in that little image, you see there's an image of Pope St. John Paul II, St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. Ignatius of Loyola. And these things bring up some elements of some of the teachings on discernment that are found throughout the tradition of the church, and they really summarize it. And this is kind of the summary that comes from a really excellent book on vocations called Paths of Love, and I believe the author's last name is Bolin. So that's a really good book, highly recommended. Out of all the different stuff you can think about on discernment, it's one of probably the most balanced presentations of discernment that is out there. Gives you some really good stuff. So check out that book. But this is the framework. There's these kind of 2 obviously false voices, or we have to learn how to know that those are the false voices. And then there's these 3 blended ways of legitimately looking at which way to go. And we're going to flesh this out in this thing. So obviously, sometimes the devil will suggest to us, or the bad spirit, or ourselves, whatever, the voice we don't want to follow will often suggest to us just what we want to do independently. And so that's kind of not the right way to go. And it might also suggest as a false good what we kind of should do abstractly. And we see that in these different things, there's always this disconnect. There's either this sense of like, hey, I'm going to be disconnected. I'm not going to follow my higher impulses. I'm just going to do what I want. And then there's a thing of like, I'm going to disregard anything legitimate in my lower impulses. I'm just going to deny myself in a negative, non-integrative way and just do what I should. And these 2 kind of things are disconnected, and they reflect what we heard in the scriptures, which say anything that denies that Jesus Christ came in the flesh is not of God. And so non-integrative, non-incarnate options, things that don't bridge that higher and lower part of ourselves, don't match the logic of the incarnation. And so we know that they're not of God. And so that's a way of looking at this. So we shouldn't do those things. But on the other hand, the voice that we want to follow, the voice that we want to pursue, the voice that is the correct voice in discernment, is like what Pope St. John Paul II says, like what St. Thomas Aquinas says, and like what St. Ignatius says. And these are ways of kind of finding a single point out of the different elements of their approaches, which are kind of summarized in the work of, in Boland's work, Paths of Love. And these, I think, are such important little phrases that I believe are going to transform your heart and give you a kind of North Star, the kind of the 3 points of the North Star of discernment, so to speak, because they give us different flavors of that high ideal that we are seeking to follow. They give you that kind of those real high ideals that you're supposed to be embodying. And there's 2 things, or there's 3 things really. One, is this thing a gift of my whole self and all the aspects of myself? Does it take into account the whole of me and make a whole gift out of all the aspects of me? Is that what it is? Is it making a gift of the whole of me and all my aspects? Is it using all of that and giving all of my gifts and incorporating all that I am and donating all of that to Christ and to other people? That's number one. That's like the Pope St. John Paul II part of this. Then there's the St. Thomas part of this, which says, Am I in general doing what is an objectively higher way of giving myself? We have to take that into account. Like, am I doing the highest possible objective way? Like, so for example, if I'm, am I considering, hey, you could be a priest, do that. You could follow the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience in some public, like being a monk way or a private way. Let's consider that, like, hey, that's important. Public or private following of the counsels in addition to the commands. That's important. We want to understand that's objectively higher. We should be discerning that from that perspective. So number 1 was, am I giving my whole self and all its aspects? Number 2 is, am I considering whether I should be giving an objectively higher gift? And number 3 is the kind of corresponds to St. Ignatius, which is, am I giving the specific gift that God is asking of me? So here's the 3 keys. The 3 keys are, am I giving all of myself and all the aspects of myself? Am I giving myself in the highest possible way? And am I giving the specific gift that God is asking? And these are the 3 ultimate ways that you can kind of find these ultimate flavors of the greatest possible generosity we could have. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to have the greatest possible generosity. And so that's really important, because these are very different than what you should do abstractly, kind of like that temptation from the devil, which looks like a good thing, and what I just want to do. These are very different voices. So that's the thing. You don't want to do that. And so when we think about this, we want to understand that there are different truths that we are acknowledging when we look at these guideposts, so to speak. The truth that's acknowledged by giving our whole self is that some things simply are a fit for us and some things are not. Like, so for example, no matter how, some things you might not be a fit being a lawyer, for example. The truth about that it's acknowledged by Pope St. John Paul II is that one. It's some things are a fit and some things are not. That's the style of discernment. Not necessarily he said that, but that's the style of discernment, that personalistic style that Boland references, is talking about some things are a fit and others are not. Then the thing about St. Thomas is some options are objectively better and some are not as good in an objective sense. That's what's being acknowledged by the fact of considering, hey, maybe I should be following the counsels instead of just the commands. And then the thing that is kind of being emphasized in this presentation, that Ignatian element, is that some things are asked by God and others aren't. So some things God's asking you to do certain things and God's not asking you to do other things, independent of those other aspects. So each one of those truths, they're not in competition. They're all complementary truths that all need to be discerned together. It's not like one wins out over the others. And so it's really important is that there's 2 lies that are denied in this approach, that are those other things. One is that your opinions and feelings don't matter, and that's kind of like just do what you should do and shut up type of approach. And then the other one is your feelings and opinions are all that matters, and that's the do what you want approach. So those are the truths and the lies that are addressed by this method of this. So we understand also that when we follow this method, there's a certain way in which we are eventually, dealing with our emotions and dealing with ourselves in this. And that is, it's not that we're not going to just be offensive to God and offensive in getting our needs met by just acting like an animal and doing what we want. But we're also not going to be defensive and kind of hold back and try to okay, I'm going to restrain my passions to do the right thing so I don't get hurt, do the wrong thing, or get emotionally invested. That's not what we want to be. We don't want to avoid being wounded, try to be good compulsively, and do all these kind of ego defense mechanisms. And we also don't want to be living for our id. It's like we don't want to be a false angel or live like an animal. These are the things we don't want to do. But instead, the Pope St. John Paul II method, the St. Thomas and the St. Ignatius method call us to be devoted to God, to be daring and generous in doing things, but also to be protective in how we deal with our emotions and things like that. So they call us to this kind of integrative way of being. And so we see that ultimately a lot of the shape of this is incarnational, and it's Trinitarian, and it's ultimately personal. So there's a lot of these elements. And when we are deciding what to do, we want to do this. We want to be able to do some important things. We want to be able to think with God, think with trusted other people, and think for ourselves. And those are all competing truths that are important to integrate. We want to be able to have all three of those things. We don't want to just overthink with ourselves. We don't want to not think about what to do and just kind of do something random. And we also don't want to let others think for us. That's also very important. These are critical things because we want to have the right type of skills being revealed. The skills that we use in our vocation are also the skills we need to have in discerning our vocation. And we need a very strong ability to we need what we might call ego strength. We need a very strong sense of self in order to persevere in any vocation. So we want to have that ability again. We want to think with God, think with others, and think for ourselves. Not like we're thinking not kind of in a prideful way, but we need to be able to have a real head on our shoulders. We can't afford to let other people be the defining factors in what we're doing. We have to really consult with those reliable people, those spiritual people, and also think with God and the church, of course. And that means what thinking with God means prayer and using the standards of the church and all that. So very important. So the right voice is very much like the Trinity. It kind of, you see all those things I'm talking about. They have all these facets that kind of counterbalance each other. They're like the incarnation. They're not about saying, "Hey, I'm going to do what I should and not care about how I feel," or "I'm going to do what I feel and not care about what I should." They're integrative. They're like the incarnation. They're like the Trinity. They're like the incarnation, and they're also like us. You can see that it fits us. That it fits us. That's the voice you should be looking for. The voice that is like you. The voice that is like the Trinity. The voice that is like the incarnation. The wrong voice is like an angel, or it's like an animal, or it's like somebody else, and that's what we don't want in our lives. So ultimately, I think these principles help us understand these different things that we heard in the Bible at the beginning about the sheep hearing the voice of God, about being transformed in the renewing of our mind, working through that baggage, so we're not living out those other voices and tempted to go into those other voices, but instead, figuring out what is the will of God, and testing the spirits. We're going to test the spirits to know which ones deny Christ in the flesh. That's what we saw. There's this kind of similarity between the kind of structure of how things look with the Trinity and the incarnation and even the personality, so that we see that the spirit that is not of God is the one that's kind of those divisive ones that kind of in an abstract or analogous way deny Christ coming in the flesh, because they deny the integration of the human personality of the higher and lower parts of the self, and they kind of deny that incarnating principle of the unique expression of that you're supposed to be in the body of Christ. So this is a very interesting way, I think, of looking at these quotes, an interesting way of considering some elements of discernment. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list these things out again. So we want to make a gift of our whole self and all the aspects of ourselves. So that's the thing. We want whatever that we choose to do, it should use our whole self and all the aspects of ourself. It should follow something that is a generally, objectively higher way of giving ourselves. And it should also try to find what is the specific thing that God is asking. It shouldn't just be what you should do abstractly or what you want to do independently. And this acknowledges the fact that some things are a fit, some things are a fit, and some things are not. That some options are better than others objectively and morally. That some things are asked of God and some things are not asked of God. And it gets rid of the lies that your opinions and your feelings don't matter, or that your opinions and feelings are all that matters. We don't want to live in a way that's offensive to God, or offensive just to other people. In a way, we don't want to live in a way that's defending ourselves mentally. Or it's an offensive way of living. Instead, we want to be devoted to God, daring and protective of our well-being. And when we make these decisions, we want to think with God, think with others, and think for ourselves. We don't want to overthink with just ourselves. We don't want to not think at all, and we don't want to let others think for us. And so the right voice ultimately is like the Trinity, like the Incarnation, and like ourselves. The wrong voice is like a false angel, like an animal. It wants us to be like a false angel, be like an animal, or be like somebody else. And so these are the important things. These are important guidelines for understanding vocation. This is really important. So I hope that this is helpful to you as you think about what path you want to take in life. And these things will help you to hear the voice of Jesus and to follow him. Because his sheep know his voice, and they'll know him and they can follow him.